Welcome to Grappling with a Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Jennifer Elder. She is a CPA and a certified speaking professional who helps leaders future-proof their businesses by making smart decisions and staying ethical. John E. McLaughlin is a captain in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps and DC Army Reserve, as well as an adjunct professor of business and ethics at the University of Maryland Global Campus. And Stuart Wiggins is chief advisor at Induna Advisors, working to significantly increase company revenue by developing positive client reports and establishing solid business relationships. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Today, October 18th, is Global Ethics Day. I had planned a different topic, but I really can't avoid addressing the current crisis in the Mideast. The plight of 2 million residents of Gaza has been desperate for decades. It may seem easy and convenient to blame Israel, but the reality of the situation is far more complicated. In 2005, after many years of conflict, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the territory and forcibly removed 10,000 of its own settlers. Some observe that Gaza had the opportunity to become another Singapore or Dubai. Instead, Hamas leaders launched missile attacks on Israel and diverted humanitarian aid to build high-tech terror tunnels and bunkers, prompting Israel to retaliate against terrorist strongholds and blockade the enclave, resulting in collateral civilian casualties and suffering, as well as widespread poverty. Now their leaders hide out in Qatar while telling their people not to evacuate before an approaching Israeli offensive. Support around the world for Israel has been overwhelming, but it hasn't stopped students at Harvard and other universities across the country, together with protesters around the world, from blaming Israel for the conflict, condemning Israeli retaliation, and even celebrating Hamas atrocities. Having studied the history of the region, it's hard not to conclude that many of these are either willfully ignorant or blinded by ideology. It's also arguable that support for Palestinians around the world legitimizes and encourages acts of terror. The French government has criminalized public support for Hamas, and there are calls for the British government to do the same. Free speech is one of the cornerstones of a free society. But when opinion is built on misinformation, and when it might actually encourage violence, to what extent should free speech be tolerated and protected? On the other hand, once governments outlaw speech where we agree it's necessary to do so, what happens when those same governments outlaw speech we think should remain permitted? And finally, when both sides of a conflict or a dispute have some merit, but when that merit is not evenly balanced, how do we acknowledge both sides without drifting into moral equivalence? A lot to handle, but we'll try to be up to the task. So the floor is open.
You certainly gave us a full plate of things to discuss. No, I should say a brief disclaimer. Nothing I will say is on behalf of the Department of Defense or the military, but having some experience with analogous groups to Hamas and having been on the other side of attacks as a member of the military, it is very difficult to avoid overreacting. What I mean by overreacting is reacting in a way that either endangers support for your cause that you would otherwise have, or causes more people to align with the people who attacked you in the first place. So without getting too into any rabbit holes to begin with, that was the number one thing that jumped out to me is Israel has a clear moral case to respond and a very difficult task to choose the right level of response ethically. And that's going to change even day to day based off developments on the ground. But that is an immediate and difficult question for them to answer.
I mean, I think that's a really good place to start. Collateral damage is something that is really uncomfortable. Even to the extent that, is it actually an ethical issue, or is it just a reality of circumstances? And then there's so many variables that can increase the likelihood, the probability of collateral damage. And then, of course, you've got the optics of it, which out of context can make reasonable response look like war crimes.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the fact that Hamas is not a political organization. So they're not going to respond in a political way. And I, like you, John, I was in the military. I was in command during the first Gulf War. And, we know that terrorist organizations are going to use civilians as props so that they can continue to build up their arsenals for fear. So it really boils down to, from my perspective, ignorance. I mean, if people don't understand history and they don't understand what the goals of some of these groups are, then they're going to make emotional decisions. And, I caught some news today, and President Biden said this. I thought he made a good point. We made an emotional decision after 9/11, and we wanted to take it out on somebody, so we went into Iraq. That was an emotional decision. There's an argument that can be said Israel's actually held their water since the attack, because they could have gone in right away. I'm not advocating either way. I'm just saying that you have to understand who the players are in the history. You know what? The last thing I want to say about history, and I'll stop. As I researched this and looked at it, I will take this back to the Crusades, is when this first started. And you can blame it on the Catholic Church. And I'm not indicting the Catholic Church, but these problems started going back to the Crusades. And then literally it got its kickstart during the Ottoman Empire. And then the wars in 1947. So if you don't understand your history, then if you don't understand how it's going to impact your decision-making, then you're going to find yourself making decisions that just continue to spiral out of control.
Before you step in, Jennifer, you can even take it farther back than that, Stuart. The Romans are the ones who actually named the region Palestine. And they got that term from the ancient Greeks. So the language and the word, the Philistines who lived there were actually transients. And that's where the word originates. But it really wasn't adopted as a local identity in a political sense until about 1920. But from the times of the Romans, you had the Byzantines after that, you had the Muslim conquest, you had the Mamluks, and eventually the Ottomans, and then the British mandates. So the history is long and complicated. Yeah, Jennifer, what do you think?
Which makes that even more difficult.
Yeah.
This is the ultimate Hatfields versus McCoys. And there is a lot of history. There's a lot of family history. There's religion, and there's emotion. And John, going back to what you said about your response and a measured response, I think some of the behaviors we're seeing out of individuals that you'd sit there and go, what were they thinking? Goes back to an emotional response. Your heart can hijack your head. And there are several studies done by neuroscientists that have found that when you are experiencing extreme emotion, either elation or anger, you actually lose IQ points, about 10 points. Now, for a lot of people, they can't afford to lose 1 point, let alone 10.
May not have a lot to spare.
Yeah, I mean, for the average person, that's 10% of your intelligence is gone. Purely because you're responding from an emotional perspective. Emotion is in the older part of your brain, reasoning is in the newer part of your brain, but that limbic system overrides. So our ability to think clearly and critically can be very clouded by our emotions. And again, let's add that history, that family behavior. And this isn't the first time there's been a conflict here. So on both sides, you have people who have lost family. And it is hard to let go of that if you feel that it was the result of something that should never have happened. And a lot of religion will go back to an eye for an eye. And it's hard to overcome that. And the last little thing I wanted to point out was, you mentioned collateral damage. What are the ethics of that phrase? We have just made killing civilians sound nice. There are a lot of phrases like that that come about in ethical scandals. In my field, you have financial statement fraud, but other people would call that earnings management. And we can start to try and make things feel a little bit better for ourselves just by changing those words.
And that's an interesting point. And I would suggest that you look at a couple of cases from World War II, the firebombing of Dresden, which I think at this point nobody defends as an ethical decision. The mass bombing of Tokyo, which is a little more complicated because it was clear that the Japanese were not willing to surrender under any circumstances, but is still ethically difficult. And a critical difference, I believe, is whether you're targeting military targets and there's inevitable spillover, or you're either targeting civilians or you're indiscriminate. You're not taking proper precautions. And those are variables that are going to come from one circumstance to another. I should have mentioned at the beginning, really, that I can't claim to be completely objective and unbiased. I am a Jew. I lived in Israel for 9 years. 2 of my children were born in Israel. I have a daughter living in Jerusalem. I have a son who was living here in St. Louis, who was on vacation for the holidays in Israel and was called up and is now on the northern border. I don't even like to say it or think about it, but the possibility of a second front opening up there with Hezbollah is really terrifying. What I believe I can say, and what I'd like to shift into at this point, because it was really the focus of our question, is the rhetoric that we use and the responsibility that we take for having our information clear, for learning our history, for learning the politics, for understanding the context, and then articulating our points of view in a way that are as even-handed as we can manage, even while we may be passionate in our perspective. So how do we, and I mean, this is a question that I almost know there's no real answer to, but differentiating between the different types of protests to say, I support the Palestinians, but I can't support Hamas, seems to be a position that we're not hearing much of. And it would,
at least we didn't hear as much as we would think up front, because that seems like the default response on some level is to differentiate between what is essentially a dictatorship in the Gaza Strip. One election, approaching 20 years ago, didn't win a majority then, but took power. And shockingly, a group of people willing to behave that way, they aren't big on dissent either. So it's fairly easy to draw that line. But that I was to loop it back to what you said, what you mentioned earlier about college students. And I don't want to give too much weight to 19-year-olds saying dumb things, because that's what every single 19-year-old, including me, a few decades back was doing at that time. But it is worth seeing how the institutions responded to the students' actions and that sort of thing. And I think the most difficult thing, and why we didn't see as much of that response as you would hope and I would have hoped, is Israel's biggest challenge in some ways is that it is a powerful entity. And it is hard to maintain sympathy, even that you are entitled to, when you are seen as the more powerful side in a conflict, because an undue part of the responsibility can fall on you, because there is no equivalent to the Israeli government in this conflict. You have Hamas and you have Palestinian civilians. And because there isn't a comparison of equals, the way the standards that different actors in this are held to can be wildly different, sometimes unfairly seemingly, but inevitably, given that with that power does come some sort of duty. Because in theory, the laws of war apply to everyone, terrorists included, but we call them terrorists for a reason. So I think that one of the reasons why we haven't seen, certainly in universities and worryingly some other places, that response, that differentiation between Hamas and Palestinian civilians, is because people are focused on seeing the entirety of the non-Israeli side as victims, because they are the less powerful side. Now, we've seen what that even limited amount of power can do in terms of the atrocities that Hamas committed. So I'm not saying less power means zero power by any stretch of the imagination. But because they are seen, especially by folks that may be younger, may not have as much context as we just discussed, because this side is seen as less powerful, they aren't held to the same standards which they should be held to.
Yeah, we love the underdog. And then, as
We
you
do
said,
love the underdog,
our
and
feelings get involved. Go ahead.
we don't always see the whole picture. And I think I was born when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. We had 3 channels and news was vetted. You didn't have wiki. You had an encyclopedia that had people vetting the information in there. But now everybody can get their 5 minutes of fame on social media. And they're not always thinking through that actions have consequences. And that sometimes what you think is your personal opinion, and we are all entitled to those, but your personal opinion can go much farther than you realized. And in the case in Harvard, that became global news. And they're seeing consequences that I am sure that these kids didn't think about. Several of them were graduating from Harvard with a law degree. They had jobs lined up. Those offers have been withdrawn. So signing one petition may have a lifelong impact on them. And John, I would agree with you, is, 18, 19-year-olds, we've all said and done stupid things. And we've all probably signed a petition somewhere where somebody said, I want you to sign here. And because the person who asked us is someone that we value, we go, okay, and you sign without reading. We don't know whether all of the people who signed that petition really understood what they were signing.
I have a really strong feeling about this, and we've talked about this a number of times. It's the way we teach people. We don't use the Socratic method. So what happens is people don't ask questions. So they see something, they see a headline, assume that headline is accurate, and they don't ask questions. Then they let their emotion. We've talked about emotion a couple of times here today. And suddenly their emotions take over. They don't ask questions. They don't know the history. And then suddenly they find themselves in a position of regret almost instantaneously. And that's what happens. I mean, I could come down on either side, and I don't favor each, because I look at the Palestinians and, Hamas treats them like dirt because they have no power. So any monies that do come in from Iran, it's all for aggressive military tactics. People are shoved into a really small space and trying to survive, and they don't have ability to come and go as they please. Well, then the Israelis on the other side, they're at risk all the time of bombs being lobbed at them. Well, it's not the civilian work people that are doing that. It's this military element of Hamas that's doing this. So unless you understand what's going on both sides, and I don't think these young people really have an appreciation for all that, then their mouth is going to get them in trouble. To me, it's a tough lesson to learn, but it's a good lesson to learn when you're young. When you're 65, 66, you don't make those kind of comments, I don't believe.
And you kind of remind me, Jennifer, that It's a few years now, but there's a fellow named Ami Horowitz who makes some very clever videos. He went around Yale University asking students to sign a petition to repeal the First Amendment. Now, of course, along with free speech, the First Amendment includes the right to petition. So there was some intentional irony here. He got 50 signatures in an hour, which was profoundly embarrassing to the administration. But you said that young people particularly, will sign things or say things without thinking them through. That's also indicative, isn't it? I wanted to ask what you think about the employers rescinding the job offers. Was that a proper response in this situation?
I say no, because they do have First Amendment rights, but it's a private company. They can hire who they want. They can make a hiring decision based on what they believe is the right thing to do. I'm not sure that if I was in a role to hire, that I would rescind the offer based on that. In fact, particularly if they were going to be attorneys, because then they should be able to argue both sides of anything moderately effective.
Right. And there's a question of, when does this become a moment for punishment, like rescinding a job offer? Or when is it a teaching moment? Could the firm still hire them and say, okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask you to write a rebuttal to your position that you stated at Harvard. Teach them to think critically and to appreciate another viewpoint.
So the rescinding may have been more of a statement, a publicity statement.
I think it's reputation management.
Yeah.
Is that the names of the people who signed the petition are public. There's a whole nother issue there of somebody hiring a moving billboard that was running around Boston with the names of these kids, which now, again, collateral damage. This now impacts their families.
Right.
That may have known nothing about what their kids were doing. And now there are people getting hate mail, emails, Facebook, and it's because their kid did something stupid.
Yeah, and at the same time, one second, John, because it also reminds me of my son when he was hired for a job that he's holding now in one of the big investment banks. They took all of the new hires out on a cruise in New York Harbor, and it was a social cruise. There was alcohol, and a couple of these new hires had a little more to drink than they should have, and on a dare, apparently, jumped off the boat into the harbor.
Oops.
They both had their job offers rescinded. Now, in that case, there was no question of morality, not really an issue of brand reputation so much, but apparently the managers felt that someone with this kind of poor judgment was not someone who should be involved in decisions that could affect hundreds of millions of dollars.
Impulse control.
Yeah.
Impulse control, the ability to stand up to peer pressure.
Right.
The ability to not jump off a boat.
Inability to think about what's in New York Harbor.
Yeah. I'll actually come down pro rescission of the job offers on one condition: that they were a leader of the group or had some role in writing the petition or did something besides just sign. I don't think the university should withdraw an offer of a high school student that does something like that. I don't think a university should expel a student that does something like that, because those are teaching institutions. And while I would hope that a workplace sees some mentoring and development role for itself in the careers of the people that it hires, I do not think it is obligated to extend that to this type of incident, so long as they had some sort of active role in what happened. I think that, and certainly having to find a different job is not the same as having to find a different university if you get expelled from one. It's not as if they would have to legally, asterisk, this is not legal advice for me, disclose that they signed this particular position in a job application anywhere else if they were not asked specifically about it. So I think it's okay for an institution to do so. Should they have waited a little bit? Should they have said, maybe we suspend it, or you can come back in a year, that sort of thing? I think that might have been advisable. A lot of what we're talking about is being reactionary, being emotional. And in organizations and workplaces can certainly be emotional also in ways that lead them to be unethical. But I will say that I'm okay. The one recension that I was aware of most notably was the person who wrote a small op-ed actively stating that everything that happened, that Hamas did, was Israel's fault and theirs alone. So that kind of clear statement written by the person's own hand, I think it's okay and ethical to rescind a job offer as a result.
So John, let me ask you a question as a military officer. Young lieutenant comes under your command, been there less than 6 months, and consumes too much alcohol and does something really stupid. I'm not going to qualify it as what it is, okay? I know, at least the military I was in, I know what the response would have been, at least for further career progression. What's your opinion on that? Or how do you see it?
I see it differently for two reasons. One, the military is different from other workplaces in that we bake in teaching and mentoring in a way that I don't ask an investment bank or a law firm to do. And I will say, as long as that drunken behavior did not involve any racist, sexist, or criminal behavior, not counting jumping off a boat. I've seen a lot of people jump off a lot of things in the military in a lot of different states of drunkenness. That happens. Please don't injure yourself doing it. But as long as it didn't touch on an issue that speaks to an underlying moral failure, they came out when you were drunk, but might still exist when you're sober. As long as it was something like jumping off a boat, honestly, I would be fine with giving that person some verbal counseling, maybe a little extra work, maybe something that was amusing to everybody else, depending on circumstances, and letting them continue with their career. It's funny because the without getting too much on a sidebar, the version of what's ethical in terms of punishing people in the military has changed in writing, but not necessarily in practice. And it's relevant to this because how much do you count somebody out and how much do you say you can be redeemed, reformed, right? And the military has tried to make it narrower what you're allowed to do and do less things that are publicly viewable to others. But meanwhile, on the ground, we know that it is better to teach someone a funny and maybe semi-public lesson in terms of to their coworkers than it is to end their career paperwork-wise. So to bring it back to the main topic of discussion with the recensions and related to an issue this serious, the military is going to be more forgiving unless it crosses one of those ethical red lines and speaks to some deeper moral failure. Did the op-eds written by these students do that? I don't know. I could see it going either way. If you're not knowledgeable about this conflict and you fire off an opinion reactively, it may not speak to any sort of racism or bigotry either way. It may speak to you being young and kind of dumb. And in that case, maybe there's more of a case that it's not a core ethical failing, but something that can be trained out of you in time.
I'm going to go back to same word, two different spellings. There's insightful, INSIGHT. Let's shed some light on a topic. But then there's insightful, INCITE, which is, getting people spun up. And in some cases, I would go back and say, what was the intent? Were you trying to educate people? And sometimes we try and we don't do a good job of it. But was the intent there to try and educate somebody? Or was the intent to spin people up in a way that may harm others? And I think that's always, for me, there's the line between a tough decision and an ethical dilemma. Tough decisions involve multiple options. There are trade-offs. There are pros and cons, risks and rewards. When we get into an ethical dilemma, there are two big differences. We have right versus right values. We have equally correct perspectives. The simple example I share with people is, when we've all had it, your spouse, your good friend, your child comes to you and says, "Don't I look awesome in this outfit?" Your inside the brain voice is going, "Oh dear, please don't tell me they're wearing that out to dinner." It's right to be mindful of somebody's feelings and say, "You look fabulous." And your brain is going, "I have a really different definition of fabulous than they do." So it's right to be mindful of somebody's feelings. It's also right to come out and go, "Oh, don't even think about leaving the house. Oh, you look horrible in that. This will not end well for you." And either answer is correct. So ethics involves this butting of heads of different values. And the second element, I think, of an ethical dilemma is somebody's getting hurt. And how do you decide what's the least bad hurt in here? And we have different viewpoints, we have different cultures, different religions here, and it just does get very, very complicated. And if we don't allow public discourse, how do we get to the insightful where we learn?
It is a lot you said there, Jennifer, that is really worth pursuing. Yeah, I remember that you formulated an idea that I had at the beginning of our conversation, and you just said it so beautifully. The difference between what might be an ethical dilemma and what might simply be a hard choice. And I remember after 9/11, one of the subjects that came up, if the military would have been in a position to shoot down those passenger planes before they hit the tower, would that have been a proper response? And the answer was almost universally yes. The question was why? And the short answer was, that's collateral damage, whether you like that term or not. This is war. They had turned the plane into a weapon, and that made it an act of war. And that made it not only a permissible, but a proper, a necessary military target. And the passengers on the plane would have been unfortunate collateral damage. And that may not even enter into the realm of an ethical decision, even though it would be an extraordinarily hard choice. So I'm really glad that you framed it that way, because those types of distinctions will help us in viewing these types of situations and circumstances. Something might be really awful. I mean, medical choices, triage. Let one person die so you can save another, because you can't save both. How you go about doing that, there may be ethics involved, but the inevitability of having to make that choice is itself not necessarily an ethical decision. We're winding down. Any final thoughts?
I hope that as time passes and the initial atrocities are followed up by more and more time for people to think, to put things, I don't want to say put things in context, because there's no such thing as a context that would make those atrocities any less horrifying, what Hamas did originally. But I think it is okay that things have followed the course they have in terms of discussion and ethics. And by that, I mean, the initial wave of rage and anger was entirely justified. And there was perhaps signs that an over response might come. But as a little bit of time was taken, as conversations were had between partners and allies, as strategies were shaped and decisions had to be made, the initial rage was put into a more productive context of how can we respond in a way that not just avenges the people who were harmed, but helps anyone else from being harmed in the future. And I've been heartened at least by signs of initial ethical quandaries have been replaced more or less, maybe not on certain campuses, maybe not on certain, extremist blogs and that sort of thing, have largely been replaced by more thoughtful conversations that will hopefully lead us to an ethical place. There's no easy solution to this, so it makes it good for a panel discussion. But I think that the forces of reason and ethics seem to be turning the tide.
I think that if you use history as an indicator, is my final thought, then any overreaction has to be carefully considered. Because I firmly believe that if we don't stop and look at the things that have happened in the past that have created the circumstances that exist today, then this will continue. I mean, to me, the United States has some culpability here because we have not actively pursued peace. We talk about a two-state solution, but we don't actively pursue that. Now something has happened and now everybody wants to overreact. So we need to study history. We need to step back, take a breath, and make some unemotional decisions, because things will spiral out of control very, very quickly. And then the genie's out of the bottle.
And Jonathan, I'd like to leave our listeners with a challenge. Is that particularly in really gnarly, multi-sided scenarios like this, is to use 3 approaches that were written about by Rushworth Kidder. Is that look at a situation and you can use utilitarianism, which is what you mentioned with, could you shoot down these planes, which is the greater good. Is it better to kill 200 people on a plane and save 3,000? So there's a greater good answer in there. But there are 2 other ways of thinking. There's rules-based. What's legal? What's a compliance answer? And then the third one would be care-based. Would you like this done to you? And so I think that in some of these scenarios where people are quick to rush to judgment or share their opinion in a rabid format, they are looking at it from one perspective and one perspective only. And that is often when you see ethical scandals come up, was when we narrow our focus and only look at it from one perspective. So I would challenge our listeners, no matter what your view is on this, expand your viewpoint. Think about it from multiple perspectives before you rush to judgment.
I think that's a wonderful way to leave off. And I think it also sort of dovetails with Stuart, with your comments about overreaction, that when you were speaking, I was thinking overreaction in a military sense, but certainly overreaction in our emotional, in our interpretation of what we as bystanders are witnessing. Oh, look at these as you said, we love the underdog. Look at these poor downtrodden people who are suffering under oppression. Well, how could you not sympathize with them? On the other hand, the situation is more complicated than that. And so I would add on or amplify your challenge, Jennifer, saying that all 3 of those methodologies that you mentioned need to work together. Utilitarianism by itself has its limits.
Mm-hmm.
What's legal? Well, I like to say that ethics begins where compliance ends. And that often compliance is the enemy of ethics because, well, I'm in compliance. I don't need to evaluate the right or wrong of what I'm doing anymore. And then the concept of the caring, the empathy. What are the ripples? And what intuitively feels right or should feel right. Feelings alone are not reliable. Intellect alone is not reliable. They're often in conflict with each other. And if we can force them into harmony, then I think we have the best chance of making more ethical decisions. Thank
Agreed.
you all. This has been a very worthwhile conversation, I think. And as usual, we leave lots on the table, but that gives us more to talk about in the future. So Jennifer Elder, John McLaughlin, Stuart Wiggins, thank you all very much, and look forward to the next time we can be together in this constellation or another one. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information there, submit your idea. If it's compelling, we will use it on a future episode. And until then, I encourage everyone to continue working hard, thinking hard to grapple with the great.